Ever imagined what it feels like to have your dignity ripped from you, to have absolutely no control over your life, body, and fate? This is what African captives went through during the dark transatlantic slave trade era. Unfortunately, the inhumane treatment, torture, and degradation only worsened after the slave trade was abolished. Enslaved women were forced to undergo the trauma of repeated rape by their enslavers, overseers, and stockmen to begin a dastardly program that continues to shock the world over 200 years later. Young children were separated from their mothers to be resold into slavery. Men were degraded and treated with disdain to keep them active. The ones bold enough to escape were chased down like dogs by overseers and drivers. Accounts of slavery have always been gruesome, but in today's video, we delve into some of the darkest torments ever unleashed on people on the face of the earth. But before we do, don't forget to like this video, drop your comments, and subscribe to the channel for more thought-provoking discussions. Let's dive right in. With the emergence of freedom fighters, British abolitionists, and Christian groups such as the Society of Friends, the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade was formed in 1787. This eventually led to the passage of the 1807 Slave Trade Act by the British Parliament, and the legal importation of captives from Africa was slowly eliminated or suppressed throughout the European and American continents. It seemed like a good time for all enslaved people across the world, but the abolitionists had underestimated the greed, desperation, and heartlessness of enslavers and drivers who had plantations to grow, and captives to torment, degrade, and work to their bones. As such, slave breeding was born. After several calls from international bodies to the U.S., urging them to stop the importation of captives from Africa, the United States passed a law prohibiting the importation of enslaved captives into the country in 1808. Activities on plantations, on the other hand, showed no sign of slowing down. Rather, the expansion of rice, cotton, and sugarcane cultivation was rapid, and the demand for labor increased drastically. The internal slave market grew. Slaveholders, unable to import captives from Africa, started breeding their own enslaved people to progress their horrific business. No longer was the strength of captives considered to be their best attribute. The fertility of women became a major part of their productivity, and young women were forced to have large numbers of children to help increase the supply of enslaved captives. Childbearing women were separated from women who were too old to breed, and during their breeding period, they were forced to mate in order to reproduce, much like horses and other farm animals. Enslaved women of breeding age no longer had any control over their bodies. The enslavers forced them to mate with enslaved men who had been reserved for that purpose during their fertile period until they were confirmed pregnant. And shortly after childbirth, the process began again. Most women as young as 22 years would have birthed between 4 to 10 children, as they weren't given much time to heal before being required to get pregnant again. By the time they were no longer of childbirthing age, some women had birthed 20 to 25 children. Such were the horrors of these atrocious breeding farms. Enslaved men weren't treated any better. In addition to the intense labor they had to undergo in terrible conditions, a group of men weighed according to their ability to fertilize women were kept aside and treated no better than animals. They were called the Stockmen. Their main function was to mate with all enslaved women of childbearing age. They were sometimes rented out to other enslavers. Older women doubled as midwives and assisted with birthing. They had no choice but to do the bidding of the enslaver. After all, the black man had no human right that the white man was to be cowered before and greatly feared. Plantation owners preferred having young captives of childbearing age, as this not only helped them acquire free labor, but they could also sell the offsprings in the internal market. The largest breeding farms were located in Virginia and Maryland. These breeding farms charged themselves with the sale and distribution of enslaved captives all through Southern America. Poverty, fertility, and health ramifications. During the period of slave breeding in the United States, the older women who were past the childbearing age served as midwives and assisted with birthing new babies. However, given the limited resources at that time, as well as the nature of work the breeding women had to go through, over 50% of the infants were born stillbirth, and a lot of women lost their lives during childbirth. Although many accounts state that the breeding women were treated better than others and given a lighter workload, the toll of repeated childbirth was often too much for them to bear. Depending on the benevolence of their enslaver, Breeding women had little time to recuperate after childbirth before being forced to go through repeated rape to get pregnant again. Breeding women were also charged with reproducing strong infants, or they were immediately condemned and considered useless. This cycle continued until the woman died, could no longer produce healthy babies, or was too old to reproduce. These women were unable to spend time bonding with the babies, as the prized offspring were sold into forced labor as babies or separated from their mamas to work on other parts of the plantation suitable for their age. Captives who weren't part of the breeding program but were unfortunate enough to be impregnated either by their husbands, lovers, or overseers were also put through the same torture. Their babies were yanked from their bosoms almost as soon as they were born and sold off or forced to work on the plantation alongside their enslaved parents. Some captives were favored enough to have affairs with their enslavers, sometimes resulting in children. Most times these kids were not treated better than others. Aside from the physical impact all these had on the breeding women and their offspring, there was the psychological effect as well. Unfortunately, there was no adequate physical or psychological care for them. The poverty rate on these plantations was enormous. Captives, regardless of their age or health conditions, were required to work from dawn to dusk, and those lucky enough to work as cooks or personal maids, although sometimes had a lighter workload, were required to be on the beck and call of their enslavers at all times. They were overworked and underfed. As a result of the harsh working conditions, enslaved families were unable to spend quality time together and often went days without seeing each other. The harsh conditions on the plantation also resulted in a lot of early death for the captives. Midwives cared for all captives as well as they could. However, they mostly used home remedies and weren't properly trained, so there was little that could be done to help the poor ones. Midwifery skills were often passed from elders to young females in order to keep the cycle moving. Some midwives also tended to low-born white women and men. On the plantation, the worth of all captives was directly tied to their productivity, either on the farms or as breeders. Breeders were forced to return to the field a day or two after childbirth, except for those with complicated births. Captives with reduced productivity were often sold off or beaten to death. In order to keep order and respect on larger plantations, plantation owners employed the use of overseers and drivers. Overseers and drivers' overseers were often white men of a lower class who were perceived to be brutal, hired by plantation owners to oversee the plantation and protect the interest of their employer. They were charged with understanding the dynamics of dealing with the captives and how best to improve productivity. Due to the nature of their job, overseers were crude, brutal, and wicked men who would do anything to make a name for themselves. Most overseers did the dirty work of the enslavers with no compassion for humanity. They were often charged with the despicable task of meting out punishments and hunting down escaped captives in order to maintain discipline and productivity on the plantations. In some accounts, some overseers were even crueler than the plantation owners and derived joy in hurting captives unprovoked. Enslaved females were subjected to constant rape by overseers. Although a few overseers treated captives much better than most, they generally didn't last long. Planters soon switched to the use of drivers. Drivers have favored captives charged with improving productivity, maintaining discipline, and meting out punishments to offending captives. Any captive could be favored or chosen by the enslaver to become a driver. However, he was often a smart, strong, and well-liked man. Drivers were more compassionate and treated their fellows better than the overseers, but were equally hated and feared by the other captives. This could be a result of jealousy or because of the nature of the responsibility bestowed on him. Once a captive was favored and named as a driver, he no longer had the trust of his peers. Most drivers lived a lonely life, forced to mete out barbaric punishments to their former friends and families to further the extreme greed and cruelty of the plantation owners. The internal slave market. In 1808, when the Atlantic slave trade was abolished, there were about 1.5 million, 1,500,000 captives. However, between that period and 1865, when slavery was abolished in the country, the population of enslaved people in the United States had increased to over 4 million, inclusive of children. That is almost a 150% increase in less than 5 decades. All this resulted from internal slave markets, which encouraged and sold the idea of slave breeding to plantation owners. The internal slave market was a place within the country where slave traders and enslavers could sell and buy enslaved captives. It had been in existence for a long time. However, the end of slave importation brought about a tremendous expansion of the internal slave market. The market largely depended on breeding farms to keep the fresh supply of enslaved people steady. The two largest breeding farms were located in Virginia and Maryland. The captives were managed as personal property and treated no better than farm animals by enslavers and traders alike. Young children below the age of 10 were separated from their mothers, and young ladies and men were paraded in front of potential buyers, sometimes naked. Their worth was determined by age, strength, physical build, and ability to work. They were left at the mercy of the traders and potential buyers, and could be asked to do anything to weigh their worth. These auctions were more than demeaning to the enslaved, but were mere transactions for the traders. Soon, traders realized the worth of younger captives and women of childbearing age. As a result, they were sold for more and forced to endure more demeaning acts during the auctions to the highest bidders. Breeders and traders took this as full-time work, as they knew the importance of enslaved people to the booming economy. They treated the enslaved as mere commodities and embraced laws that viewed captives as things and not people. New Orleans had the largest slave market in the U.S. and was one of the largest and wealthiest cities in the country as a result of the economic effect of the slave trade. Gruesome accounts from formerly enslaved captives. After slavery was abolished in the mid-1800s, many formerly enslaved people wrote books in which they gave vivid accounts of the humiliating and demeaning life of the enslaved. The narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, was written by Frederick Douglass, who was born into slavery. The interesting narrative of the life of O. Equiano, or G. Vasa, the African, was written by Olaudah Equiano, who was captured as a child. Incidents in the Live of a Slave Girl, written by herself, was written by Harriet Jacobs, an abused enslaved captive. William Wells Brown, who was born into slavery, wrote a book titled Narrative of William W. Brown, a fugitive slave, written by himself. Over 2,300 former captives gave their accounts for the Born in Slavery exhibit on the crude treatment of enslaved people in the United States. Years after slave trade was abolished, blacks and ex-slaves were still ill-treated in the United States and were seen as lesser humans. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. It's been centuries, but even the passage of time has not reduced the gravity of the dastardly acts carried out in slave breeding farms and the internal markets. As we look to heal the world and move on from the terrible events of our dark and murky past, we must never forget the atrocious acts committed on slave breeding farms and every other horrific aspect of the Atlantic slave trade. Thanks for joining us for today's video. Remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on post notifications so you never miss any of our thought-provoking discussions about these shocking events that will always be a part of our history. Thanks for watching.